Genevieve. I did not expect to find you here. I turned slowly from the memorial display, my black dress catching the autumn light that filtered through the Heritage Gardens iron gates. The voice had not changed in 17 years. That particular way he said my name, as though it were a word he had learned but never quite understood. Richard Alcott stood at the entrance to the Historical Society grounds, silver touching his temples now, his overcoat whispering of expense with every subtle movement. Time had polished him the way it favors men with resources and absolute conviction in their own rightness. His posture still proclaimed ownership of whatever space he occupied. On his arm walked a woman perhaps 30 years old, blonde hair swept into an elegant twist, one slender hand resting on the unmistakable curve of late pregnancy. Really, Richard? You did not expect to see me at an event honoring my own mother. He adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture I remembered from years of watching him prepare for meetings where he intended to dominate the room. Well, it has been a long time. I assumed you had moved on from Milbrook entirely. Not long enough. He smiled then, the practiced expression of a man who believes he has already won whatever contest might be unfolding. This is Danielle. We are expecting our first daughter next month. The woman beside him offered a polite smile that held genuine warmth beneath its social veneer. Richard has told me so much about this town. The preservation work here is quite impressive. I wondered which version of our shared history he had offered her. The narrative where I was too provincial to accompany him to grander things. Or the one where my body failed to produce the heir his family name demanded. Congratulations. The word turned to ash on my tongue. Motherhood is a remarkable journey. Richard's hand moved to rest possessively on Danielle's belly, his eyes gleaming with something I recognized too well. We are so blessed. Some women simply are not meant for motherhood, of course. No shame in accepting one's limitations. The cruelty landed exactly where he intended it to land. 17 years dissolved in an instant, and I was once again the woman he had deemed defective, the failed investment he had written off without a backward glance. Before I could respond, a tall figure emerged from the crowd near the dedication platform. Dark hair swept across his forehead, angular features arranged in that particular expression of focused intelligence I had watched develop over 16 years of ordinary mornings and extraordinary moments. Mom. Dr. Pemberton needs you for the opening remarks. I watched Richard's face as recognition struck him like a physical blow. My son stood before him, unmistakably his son, and 17 years of absolute certainty began their slow, irreversible collapse. Owen stood nearly 6 feet tall now, his shoulders broad, his bearing confident without arrogance. The resemblance was undeniable. The same jaw. The same penetrating grey eyes. The same way of tilting his head when assessing a situation. Richard's complexion shifted from confident warmth to something pale and uncertain. That is impossible. Owen regarded him with calm curiosity, the way one might observe an interesting but not particularly important specimen. You must be Richard Alcott. I have seen your photograph in the business magazines. Not my father. Not even the man my mother was once married to. Just a name attached to a face in a magazine. The dismissal was so complete, so utterly without malice or longing, that I saw something flicker in Richard's expression that might have been the first genuine emotion I had witnessed from him in 2 decades. The dedication starts soon. I turned to Danielle, whose confusion was rapidly transforming into something more complicated. We should continue this conversation elsewhere. This is neither the time nor the place. Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell where you are watching from and what time it is where you are at. If you are new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever. I met Richard Alcott 20 years ago at a winter lecture series in Boston. The conference focused on archival preservation, a gathering of librarians and historians and museum specialists who spent their lives protecting what others considered expendable. I was 24 years old, newly appointed as assistant curator at the Milbrook Historical Society, filled with a particular idealism that had not yet been worn down by disappointment. My grandmother had established the society 3 generations earlier, and I had grown up understanding that some things were worth saving simply because they connected us to who we had been. Richard was 30, already making his first significant fortune in technology, handsome in that way that makes intelligent women momentarily forget their intelligence. He moved through the reception with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. The crowd was thick with wealthy donors seeking tax deductions dressed as philanthropy. I had positioned myself near a display case containing 18th-century correspondence, studying the faded handwriting while the networking swirled around me. "You are not mingling." His voice came from just behind my shoulder, warm with amusement. "I am not particularly skilled at pretending interest in conversations about profit margins and charitable deductions." He laughed, and something in the sound caught me off guard. It was not the polished social response I would later recognize as performance. Something genuine crinkled the corners of his eyes. "What interests you, then, if not the impressive gathering of checkbooks in this room?" I gestured toward the glass case. "These letters. Written by a woman named Abigail Thornton while her husband was at sea for 3 years. She managed his shipping business, negotiated with creditors, prevented bankruptcy, and grew their holdings by 40%. History remembers him as a merchant prince. No one recorded her name until we discovered these documents last year. And you find that compelling. I find it criminal. That someone can do extraordinary work and have it erased because they were not considered worth remembering." He studied me for a long moment, his expression shifting from amusement to something more complicated. "I am Richard Olcott, and I would very much like to buy you dinner." I should have recognized the warning signs in that first conversation. The way he assumed my agreement before asking for it. The subtle condescension in his surprise that I had opinions worth hearing. But I was young, and he was charming, and I mistook his intensity for depth. Our courtship lasted 6 months. Richard pursued me with the same focused determination he applied to his business acquisitions. Weekend trips to coastal towns I had always wanted to visit. Long conversations about our different worlds, his technology ventures and my passion for forgotten histories. He seemed genuinely fascinated by my work, asking questions that suggested real curiosity. My mother watched these developments with gentle concern she rarely voiced directly. "He seems to expect the world to arrange itself around his preferences, Genevieve. I wonder what happens when it does not." "He is ambitious, Mom. That is not a flaw." "Ambition is not a flaw. But ambition without humility becomes something else entirely." I dismissed her concerns as the natural wariness of a mother watching her daughter fall in love with a man from a different world. Richard's family came from generations of wealth, Beacon Hill propriety and summer homes on the Cape. My family was modest New England stock, teachers and nurses and archivists, people who worked with their hands and hearts and expected nothing more than dignity for their efforts. The proposal came on a February evening, snow falling outside the window of the restaurant where we had shared our first meal. Richard had arranged for musicians, for champagne, for an audience of strangers who would witness his grand gesture. He knelt before me with a ring that caught the light, and the room fell silent, and there was no space to consider anything except the answer he expected. "Yes." The word came out breathlessly, because how could it not? He was offering me everything I thought I wanted. Security, passion, a life larger than the one I had imagined for myself. We married that autumn. The ceremony made the society pages, the preservation specialist and the technology entrepreneur, a modern fairy tale they called it. His family attended with reservations they barely concealed behind their polished manners. My family attended with hope they could not quite suppress. The first year of marriage was everything I had dreamed. Richard took genuine interest in my expeditions to assess historical properties, accompanying me to crumbling farmhouses and forgotten archives, listening as I explained the significance of architectural details he might once have dismissed as obstacles to development. We traveled to cities I had only read about. We made plans for a future that seemed limitless. And then came the expectations. His mother began mentioning grandchildren within months of our wedding. Subtle questions over Sunday dinners that grew less subtle with each passing season. "The Olcott name requires continuation, Genevieve. Surely you understand the importance of legacy." Richard echoed her sentiments with increasing frequency. Not as a shared hope between partners, but as an expectation, a scheduled acquisition, another item on the agenda of his carefully planned life. My father was 34 when I was born. Perfect timing. A man established in his career, ready for the responsibility. I am 31 now. The romantic spontaneity of our early marriage gave way to temperature charts and scheduled intimacy. Something mechanical replaced the warmth between us, A sense that my body had become a vehicle for his ambitions rather than a source of genuine connection. 6 months of trying yielded nothing. Then a year. The negative pregnancy tests accumulated like evidence in a case being built against me. The doctor visits began. First routine examinations, then increasingly invasive procedures. Blood tests that left my arms bruised. Ultrasounds that revealed nothing wrong but also nothing right. Hormone treatments that left me bloated and emotional and exhausted. All while building my career at the Historical Society. All while caring for artifacts and documents and the memories of strangers. All while failing to create the one thing my husband seemed to value above all else. Something must be wrong with you. Richard said it over dinner one evening, 3 years into our marriage. He did not look up from his steak, delivering the assessment as casually as he might have commented on the weather. I set down my fork, my appetite vanishing. The doctor recommended that we both be tested comprehensively. There are factors on both sides that could be contributing. The Alcott men have never had fertility issues. His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. My grandfather had 6 children. My father had 4. We are known for our virility. It was the first time I truly saw the coldness in his eyes. The absolute certainty that any problem must originate somewhere other than himself. The specialists insisted on evaluating both partners. Richard returned from his appointment radiating satisfaction, his posture straighter than it had been in months. Excellent results. The doctor used the word impressive. He placed his hand on my shoulder, the gesture more patronizing than comforting. We will figure out what is wrong with you, Genevieve. There are treatments. Options. More tests followed. More treatments. More failures. And with each negative result, Richard grew more distant. His touch became reluctant, then rare, then non-existent. His presence in our home took on the quality of a resentful boarder rather than a husband. I found him one night in his study, standing before the portrait of his grandfather that hung above his desk. 4 generations of Alcott men gazed down from that wall, all with the same steel-grey eyes and rigid certainty. I will not be the one who breaks the chain. His voice was barely a whisper, unaware that I stood in the doorway. I cannot be the failure. He was not speaking to me. He was speaking to the ghosts of expectation that haunted him, the weight of legacy that mattered more than anything I could offer. And in that moment, I understood that I had never been a partner to him. I had been a means to an end. And the end was slipping beyond his grasp. 3 years into our marriage, I came home early from a preservation conference to find suitcases arranged in our hallway. Richard stood by our bedroom window, phone in hand, his posture that of a man who had already left even before his body followed. What is going on? My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Flat. Distant. As though some part of me had known this moment was coming and had begun preparing without my conscious awareness. This is not working, Genevieve. He turned from the window, and I searched his face for something recognizable. Regret. Sadness. Even anger. Anything that might suggest the man I had married still existed somewhere beneath the polished exterior. I found nothing. The specialists confirmed what I suspected. His voice was rehearsed, the words delivered with the clinical detachment of a man terminating an underperforming employee. You will never conceive. The Alcott legacy cannot end with me. So you are leaving. 3 years of marriage, and you are leaving because my body does not perform to your specifications. I need a wife capable of giving me what I require. He picked up his suitcases as though this conversation was already concluded. My family deserves an heir, not a genetic dead end. The phrase landed like a blow. Genetic dead end. As though I were a defective product being returned, a failed experiment to be discarded and forgotten. And what about love? My voice cracked despite my efforts to control it. What about the vows we made? What about the life we built together? Richard finally met my eyes, and what I saw there has haunted me across every year since. Nothing. No love. No regret. No recognition that I was a human being who had given him everything I had to offer. Love does not continue a bloodline, Genevieve. Sentiment does not perpetuate a legacy. He moved toward the door, suitcases in hand, already mentally departed for whatever came next. I have already found someone more suitable. The lawyers will be in contact regarding the settlement. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Not even the dignity of a slam. Just the quiet conclusion of everything I had believed my life would be. I stood alone in the house that had never truly been mine, surrounded by furniture I had not chosen and artwork that meant nothing to me, and I understood that I had been erased as thoroughly as any forgotten name in any historical archive I had ever studied. The divorce concluded with brutal efficiency. Richard's lawyers offered a settlement that seemed adequate on paper, enough to start over if one did not examine too closely what was being lost. I was too devastated to negotiate, too humiliated to prolong proceedings that reminded me with every document and signature of every inadequacy he had assigned to me. My mother came to help me pack the belongings I was permitted to take. We worked in silence mostly, wrapping dishes I would never use and folding linens that held no memories worth preserving. "You will survive this, Genevieve." Her voice was gentle but certain. "You will discover that everything he made you believe about yourself was a lie." I wanted to believe her. But 3 years of being told I was broken had taken root somewhere deep, and believing her felt like more effort than I could summon. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I saw Richard at a restaurant in Boston. I had gone to meet a former colleague, hoping that professional conversation might distract me from the wreckage of my personal life. He sat at a corner table with a blonde woman I would later learn was his first post-divorce girlfriend. They were laughing, his hand possessively covering hers on the white tablecloth, his posture relaxed and confident in a way I had not seen since our earliest days together. I retreated to the bathroom and was physically sick. The speed of his recovery was the cruelest cut. 2 months, and he had already replaced me. 2 months, and the marriage that had consumed 3 years of my life had left no visible mark on his. I was so easy to forget. So simple to exchange for someone more suitable. That same night, alone in the small apartment I had rented with my share of the settlement, I realized my cycle was late. Very late. The pregnancy test seemed like cosmic cruelty. A joke the universe was playing on a woman who had already absorbed more disappointment than she knew how to carry. 2 pink lines. Clear as anything I had ever seen. Impossible. According to 3 fertility specialists and the man who had discarded me like a broken appliance. Yet there it was. Life growing inside the body Richard had declared barren. I sat on the bathroom floor for an hour, the test in my hand, my mind refusing to process what my eyes could plainly see. 3 years of temperature charts and hormone injections and invasive procedures had produced nothing. 2 months after Richard walked out the door, and my body had done exactly what everyone said it could not do. The mathematics did not lie. The problem had never been me. I called Richard's office the following morning. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone. "Mr. Alcott is unavailable for personal matters involving former relationships." His assistant's voice was polished and dismissive, the tone of someone trained to deflect inconvenience. "If you have a legal concern, please contact his attorneys directly." "This is not a legal matter. It is personal and urgent. Please just tell him Genevieve called. I will pass along the message." She did not pass along the message. Or if she did, Richard chose not to respond. I tried again the next day. And the day after that. 5 attempts across 2 weeks, each one met with increasingly firm rejections. The final time, Richard himself accepted the call. I recognized his voice immediately, that particular blend of impatience and condescension that I had somehow mistaken for confidence during our courtship. "Genevieve, this harassment needs to stop. Whatever you want from me, my attorneys are perfectly capable of addressing it. Richard, please listen to me. This is important. I have moved on with my life. I suggest you do the same. I am pregnant." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across years rather than seconds. "That is impossible." His voice had gone cold in a way I recognized. The voice he used when a business negotiation turned unexpectedly complicated. And if it is somehow true, it is clearly not mine. Do the mathematics, Richard. 3 years of trying produced nothing. 2 months after you leave, I am pregnant. What does that suggest about where the problem actually resided? I am not interested in your desperate fabrications. The coldness in his voice intensified. If you persist with these absurd claims, I will be compelled to pursue legal remedies. I am not fabricating anything. I am telling you the truth. You have a child coming into this world, and you deserve to know that. What I know is that you are a bitter woman attempting to manipulate me into reconciliation through lies. The specialists were clear about your condition. Whatever situation you have gotten yourself into, it has nothing to do with me. Richard, please. Do not contact me again. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I had offered him the truth, and he had thrown it back at me like contaminated evidence. Not because he genuinely doubted me, but because accepting the truth would require him to question everything he believed about himself. 1 week later, a certified letter arrived from his legal team. The language was formal and threatening, promising a defamation lawsuit if I persisted in making false and malicious assertions regarding paternity against Mr. Alcott. My mother found me on the kitchen floor, the letter crumpled beside me, tears I had been holding back for months finally breaking through. He will not believe me. The words came out between sobs. Or worse, he simply does not care. She lowered herself to the floor beside me, her joints protesting the movement, and pulled me into her arms the way she had when I was a child frightened by thunderstorms. Then he forfeits any claim to this child. Her voice was fierce in a way I rarely heard from her. We will raise this baby together, Genevieve. Without his name. Without his money. Without his conditional love. What if the baby looks like him? What if everyone can see? Then everyone will see what he walked away from. Everyone will witness exactly what his certainty cost him. She helped me to my feet, her weathered hands steady on my shoulders. We will leave this place. Start over somewhere he cannot touch us. And we will build a life so full of love that his absence will mean nothing. I left Massachusetts within the week. Changed my name back to Holloway, my mother's maiden name, severing the last connection to the Alcott legacy Richard valued so highly. Moved to Portland, Maine, where my mother had family and where I could transfer my archival credentials without starting entirely from scratch. I told no one except my mother about the pregnancy's true origins. The story I offered was simple enough that no one questioned it. A brief relationship after my divorce. A man who was not ready for fatherhood. Nothing more needed to be said. My mother joined me 3 months before my due date, leaving behind the house where she had lived for 40 years to help me build something new. We rented a small apartment near the waterfront, nothing like the colonial mansion I had shared with Richard, but filled with the kind of warmth those elegant rooms had never known. Owen David Holloway arrived on a March morning when the last snow was still melting from the hills. 7 pounds, 11 ounces of impossible miracle. The delivery nurse placed him in my arms, and I searched his tiny features for traces of the man who had rejected his existence before it began. Richard's jaw, already visible in the infant contours of his face. Richard's grey eyes, though all babies have grey eyes at first. Something in the shape of his brow that echoed generations of Alcott men I had seen in portraits. But also something of my mother in the curve of his mouth. Something of my grandmother in the way his small fingers curled around mine. Handsome boy. The nurse smiled as she adjusted his blanket. He has got a distinguished look about him. I could not bring myself to explain the complicated truth. Instead, I traced his features with my finger, memorizing every detail of this face that belonged half to me and half to the man who had deemed me worthless. You look exactly like yourself, I whispered to my sleeping son. And that is all you ever need to be. Single motherhood was not the existence I had imagined for myself. But with my mother's help, we constructed something whole from the wreckage Richard had left behind. I took a position at the Portland Historical Archives, working evening shifts while my mother watched Owen. We eventually moved to a small farmhouse outside the city, a place with a garden where my mother could grow vegetables and a barn that Owen would later convert into a workshop for his endless projects. Nothing like Richard's world of polished surfaces and calculated impressions, but filled with more genuine warmth than all his wealth had ever purchased. Owen was curious from the beginning, asking questions that startled adults with their precision and depth. By 4, he was cataloguing his rock collection with proper scientific labels, demanding to know the geological history of each specimen. By 6, he was accompanying me on archival expeditions, understanding instinctively why old things mattered, why some objects carried weight beyond their material form. His questions about his father began around the same age. "Mama, why do I not have a daddy?" The words came after a classmate's father attended a school career day, standing before the class in his firefighter uniform while all the children gazed up in admiration. I had prepared for this question. Rehearsed age-appropriate responses that balanced honesty with protection. Still, my throat tightened around the words. You do have a father, sweetheart. He just does not live with us. Owen considered this, his small brow furrowed with the intensity he brought to every problem. Where does he live? In a different place. Very far away from here. Why does he not want to know me? The innocent cruelty of the question cut deeper than anything Richard had ever said to me directly. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that are hard to understand. Your father did not know how to be a daddy when you were born. Some people are not ready for that kind of love. Will he learn how someday? The hope in his voice was the worst part. That desperate longing for something I could not give him, something I had no power to create. I do not know, love. But what I do know is that you are so loved. By me. By Grandma. By everyone who knows you. You are loved exactly as you are. He nodded slowly, accepting this answer the way children accept the limitations adults impose on their understanding. But the question never fully disappeared. It lived beneath the surface of our life together, emerging occasionally in different forms as he grew older and his comprehension deepened. At 8, after studying a family tree project at school, he asked why his tree looked different from his classmates. Some families have different shapes than others. I told him. What matters is not the shape of the tree, but the strength of the roots. At 10, he asked if I had any photographs of his father. I hesitated, then retrieved the single image I had kept. Our wedding portrait, the two of us standing before the church where we had exchanged vows that he had never intended to honor. Owen studied the photograph for a long moment. I have his eyes. Yes, you do. He handed the photograph back without further comment. At 12, he asked for the fuller truth, and I gave it to him. We sat together on the porch of our farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of amber and rose. My mother was inside preparing dinner, giving us privacy for a conversation she knew needed to happen. Your father and I met when I was young. We married, and we were happy for a time. But he wanted children very badly, and when years passed without a pregnancy, he blamed me. He believed something was wrong with me. Was there? No. I kept my voice steady. The doctors tested us both, but he refused to consider that the problem might be his. When he left, he told me I would never be able to have a child. That I was defective. Owen's jaw tightened. A familiar gesture that I now recognized came directly from Richard. But you did have a child. I did. 2 months after he left, I discovered I was pregnant with you. Did you tell him? I tried. I called his office repeatedly. When I finally reached him, he accused me of lying. His lawyers sent a letter threatening to sue me if I continued making claims about paternity. Owen absorbed this, his expression unreadable. So he knows I might exist, but he chose not to find out. He chose not to believe it was possible. Because believing would have meant admitting he was wrong about himself. My son nodded slowly, processing information that would have devastated most children his age. But Owen had always possessed a capacity for understanding that exceeded his years. That is his loss, then. His voice was quiet but certain. He missed knowing me. And I am worth knowing. I pulled him close, tears tracking down my cheeks. You are absolutely worth knowing. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. The years passed with a particular rhythm that time adopts when you stop measuring it against what might have been and start appreciating what is. Owen flourished in ways that continually surprised me. His mind was brilliant and restless, moving from interest to interest but always returning to his core passion for how things worked, both mechanically and historically. By 15, he was building radio telescopes in the barn. By 16, he was corresponding with university professors about architectural preservation techniques. My own career advanced steadily. Assistant archivist became senior archivist, became director of the Portland Historical Archives. The work my grandmother had begun, the work my mother had supported, continued through me and would eventually continue through Owen in his own way. Richard's name appeared occasionally in magazines and newspapers. His technology company had grown into an empire, making him wealthy beyond anything I had witnessed during our marriage. His face gazed out from business publications, always with that same expression of controlled certainty, as though the universe existed primarily to validate his expectations. He married again, a woman from a prominent Boston family. They divorced 3 years later. He married a third time, a younger woman whose photographs suggested beauty without substance. I stopped tracking the details, though the information found its way to me regardless. Each marriage produced no children. The Alcott legacy remained unextended. And somewhere in Massachusetts, the portraits of generations of Alcott men gazed down at a son who had failed to continue their line while his actual heir grew strong and remarkable in Maine, unknown and unacknowledged. My mother's diagnosis came when Owen was 15. She had been tired for months, a fatigue she attributed to age and the endless activity of keeping up with her grandson. But the tiredness persisted, and then came other symptoms. Weight loss. Pain she tried to hide. A cough that would not resolve. The tests revealed ovarian cancer, already advanced by the time the symptoms became impossible to ignore. The prognosis was months, not years. She received the news with characteristic calm, the same steady strength she had displayed throughout her life. I have had a good run, Genevieve. 81 years. A daughter who became everything I hoped for. A grandson who amazes me every single day. Most people do not receive half so much. I could not match her composure. I wept in the hospital hallway, in my car in the parking lot, in the bathroom of our farmhouse where neither she nor Owen could witness my collapse. But she had one more request. Promise me something. We sat together in her hospital room, the machines beeping softly around us. Owen was reading in the corner, pretending not to listen while absorbing every word. Anything. When I am gone, do not hide anymore. Her grip on my hand was surprisingly strong for someone so diminished by illness. Do not let his shadow keep you small. Mom. The Historical Society in Milbrook is holding its centennial celebration next fall. Your grandmother founded that institution. Your family built it. You belong there, delivering the dedication speech, showing everyone what you have made of your life. Richard is still in Milbrook. His company transformed that town. He is unavoidable there. Good. Let him see what he discarded. Let him witness Owen, this remarkable boy who exists despite everything Richard believed. Some truths need witnesses, Genevieve. Promise me you will let this truth be seen. I looked at my son, still pretending to read, his jaw tight with emotions he was trying to control. I promise. She died 7 months later, peacefully, on a Tuesday afternoon when the autumn light slanted golden through her window. Owen held one hand. I held the other. Her final words were barely audible, but I heard them clearly. I am so proud of both of you. And then she was gone. The house felt different after that. Too quiet. The routines we had built around her presence became empty repetitions of movements that no longer served their purpose. I found myself reaching for the phone to call her, walking toward her room to ask a question, expecting to hear her voice from the kitchen where she had spent so many mornings preparing breakfast for Owen and me. Owen grieved in his own way, quietly and privately, throwing himself into his projects with an intensity that worried me. But when I tried to talk to him about it, he simply shook his head. She would not want us to fall apart, Mom. She would want us to keep going. So that is what I am doing. He was right, of course. He usually was. The centennial celebration was scheduled for the following October. Invitations arrived from the Historical Society Board, formally requesting that I deliver the dedication speech honoring my grandmother and mother's contributions to the organization they had built. I stared at the invitation for a long time before responding. Are you sure about this? Owen asked the question over dinner, his grey eyes, Richard's eyes, fixed on my face. Your grandmother wanted this. She wanted us to stop hiding. I am not hiding. I am just living my life. There is a difference. Is there? He set down his fork, considering the question with his characteristic seriousness. You changed your name. You moved 500 miles away. You never told anyone in Milbrook that I exist. Those seem like hiding behaviors to me. The accuracy of his observation stung. I was protecting you. From what? From a father who does not know I exist. From a family that does not know I am part of them. From a town where my grandmother built something that mattered. Owen. I am not angry, Mom. He reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I'm just saying that maybe Grandma was right. Maybe it is time to let people see the truth. And if Richard is there, if he says something cruel. My son smiled, and in that moment, I saw both the child I had raised and the man he was becoming. Then he will say something cruel. And I will know exactly who he is. And we will go home to our life, and it will not change anything that matters. I wish I had his confidence. I wish I believed that facing Richard would be as simple as observing him from a safe distance and then returning to our normal existence. But I had made a promise to my dying mother. And I would keep it. The drive to Milbrook took 7 hours. Owen slept for part of it, his long frame folded awkwardly in the passenger seat, his face younger in sleep than the serious composure he presented to the world. I watched the landscape change as we crossed state lines, the familiar territories of my childhood giving way to the coastal towns I had once explored with Richard during our courtship. Everything looked different now. Smaller somehow. Less significant. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. Milbrook itself had transformed dramatically. Richard's technology company had brought money and people and development, turning the sleepy historical community into something more polished and prosperous. New buildings gleamed alongside the preservation district my grandmother had fought to protect. The irony was not lost on me. Richard had made his fortune here, building over the past while my family had dedicated themselves to preserving it. And somehow, both efforts had coexisted, neither entirely victorious. Our hotel sat at the edge of the historic district, a restored colonial in that my mother would have approved of. I checked us into adjoining rooms, and Owen immediately began exploring while I unpacked the black dress I had chosen for the dedication ceremony. The dress I had worn to my mother's funeral. The dress I would wear to honor her memory. The dress Richard would see when he realized that everything he had believed about me was wrong. I had not expected him to attend. His family had no connection to the historical society, and his presence seemed unlikely given his focus on building the future rather than preserving the past. But there he was, walking through the wrought iron gates on the morning of the dedication. A pregnant woman on his arm. That familiar posture of ownership and certainty. And then Owen appeared. And everything Richard believed about himself began to crumble. The side room off the main chapel was small and private, the kind of space designed for family consultations before memorial services. Victor Crane, a longtime board member who had known my grandmother well, guided us there with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. Owen had disappeared with my cousin, mercifully absent from what promised to be an uncomfortable conversation. "You expect me to believe that boy is mine." Richard's voice had recovered its usual arrogance, though something uncertain flickered beneath the surface. Danielle stood beside him, her complexion pale, one hand curved protectively over her pregnant belly. "I do not require your belief, Richard. The truth does not depend on your acceptance." "The truth," he scoffed, the sound harsh in the quiet room, "is that you have constructed an elaborate lie. Perhaps you conceived with someone else after our divorce and decided to attribute the child to me for financial gain. For what purpose?" I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "I never contacted you. Never requested support. Never mentioned your name to Owen until he was old enough to understand. What could I possibly gain from a deception I never intended to reveal? Then why reveal it now?" "I did not reveal anything. You walked through that gate. You saw him." The resemblance spoke for itself. Danielle's voice cut through the tension between us, her eyes moving from Richard to me and back again. "Richard, is what she is saying possible?" He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between us like a held breath. "There were fertility tests," I continued, my voice calm despite the chaos inside me. 17 years ago. Tests we both underwent at the specialist's insistence. I never saw your results. You told me they were excellent. That the problem resided entirely with me. Ancient history. But Dr. Constance Pemberton was consulting at that clinic. She was my family's physician. She knew my mother well. And she saw both files. Richard's composure cracked visibly for the first time. "She told my mother before she died." I let the words land deliberately. "Your results showed significant issues. Natural conception would have been extremely unlikely. You knew, Richard. You knew, and you let me believe I was defective." The room seemed to contract around us. Danielle had gone very still, her expression shifting from confusion to something harder. "Is this true?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you know she was trying to contact you after the divorce? She is manipulating the situation. I have never asked you for anything, Richard. My voice remained quiet, but each word carried the weight of 17 years. No money. No acknowledgement. Nothing. We came back to Milbrook for my mother's funeral and to honor my grandmother's work. Not to disrupt your life. And yet here we are. His voice had turned cold. Disruption accomplished. The disruption is of your own making. I met his eyes without flinching. You walked into this event. You approached me. You saw a son you spent 17 years pretending could not exist. The door opened, and Owen entered. He paused just inside, assessing the tension with that particular intensity one recognized from countless moments of watching him process complex information. He was tall now, nearly 6 feet, his shoulders broad, his bearing confident without arrogance. The resemblance to Richard was even more striking in this confined space. The same jaw. The same penetrating grey eyes. The same way of holding himself when entering an uncertain situation. Richard stared at him. Truly looking now. Searching for evidence, for doubt, for anything that would allow him to maintain the narrative he had constructed about his own infallibility. He found none. You are my biological father. Owen's voice was calm, factual, stripped of either accusation or longing. Mom told me when I was 12. I have known for 5 years now. She never told me. She tried. Your lawyers threatened her with a lawsuit. Owen crossed the room to stand beside me, his presence solid and reassuring. You chose not to know. That was your decision. Now you know. That is just a fact. Richard seemed to age 10 years in the span of a few seconds. The polished certainty that had defined him for as long as I had known him was visibly crumbling, revealing something fragile and uncertain beneath. I want to understand. His voice cracked slightly. To explain. There is nothing to explain. Owen's words were gentle but final. You made decisions based on what you wanted to believe about yourself. Those decisions had consequences. I am one of them. Mom raised me without you because you made that the only option available. And she did an extraordinary job. He turned to me, his grey eyes warm with a love that had nothing to do with bloodlines or legacy or any of the things Richard had valued above all else. Dr. Pemberton is waiting for you. The dedication starts in 20 minutes. I nodded, reaching up to squeeze his hand briefly before turning toward the door. Wait. Richard's voice stopped me. I turned back to find him looking at Owen with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something raw and hungry and desperately sad. He looks exactly like my father. At his age. The photographs. Owen regarded him without hostility but also without the desperate longing for connection that Richard had perhaps expected. Mom says I have her brains, though. A ghost of a smile touched Richard's lips. If that is true, you are fortunate. Your mother was always the smartest person in any room. The unexpected compliment caught me off guard. I searched his face for the familiar mockery but found only distant sadness. Danielle stepped forward, her hand pressed against her temple. I think I need some air. She kept her voice carefully controlled. This is neither the time nor the place to continue. Richard, we should leave. Mrs. Holloway is honoring her mother today. It was the first compassionate statement anyone had made since this confrontation began. I nodded gratefully to her. Thank you. She met my eyes, and something passed between us. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding between two women who had both navigated the complicated landscape of loving Richard Alcott. Richard. Her voice was firm now. We are going home. To my surprise, he yielded. The man who had never conceded anything in his life simply nodded and followed his pregnant wife toward the door. But he cast one last long look at Owen before leaving. And in that look, I saw everything he had lost. Every morning he had not witnessed. Every achievement he had not celebrated. Every ordinary moment of fatherhood he had thrown away because his certainty mattered more than truth. The door closed behind them, and the room fell silent. Well. Victor Crane cleared his throat. That was quite the reunion. Owen stood beside me, his arm coming around my shoulders in a protective gesture that made my heart ache with pride and sorrow combined. Are you okay, Mom? I nodded, reaching up to squeeze his hand. I am fine. I am sorry you had to witness that. I am not. He smiled slightly. I have wondered about him my whole life. Now I do not have to wonder anymore. We walked together back toward the main gathering, where the dedication ceremony awaited. The crowd had no idea what had just transpired in that small side room. They saw only the director of the Portland Historical Archives and her tall, handsome son, arriving to honor the women who had built the institution they were celebrating. But something fundamental had shifted. 17 years of secrets had finally been spoken aloud. 17 years of Richard's certainty had finally crumbled. And somewhere, I hoped, my mother was watching. Witnessing the truth she had always known would eventually demand to be seen. The dedication speech was a blur of words I had written and rewritten in the weeks before. I spoke about preservation and memory, about the courage required to protect what others considered expendable, about my grandmother who had founded this institution and my mother who had supported it, and all the unnamed women throughout history who had done extraordinary work that no one remembered to record. But beneath the formal language, I was speaking directly to Richard. Some legacies are built through names and bloodlines. My voice carried across the assembled crowd. But the truest legacies are built through presence. Through showing up day after day for the people and places we love. Through choosing preservation over convenience, patience over impatience, truth over the comfortable fictions we tell ourselves. Owen watched from the audience, his grey eyes bright with something that might have been pride or might have been unshed tears. My mother asked me to deliver this speech. She wanted me to honor the work she and my grandmother dedicated their lives to protecting. But more than that, she wanted me to stop hiding. I paused, letting the words settle. Some truths need witnesses. Some stories deserve to be told even when telling them is difficult. This institution exists because my grandmother believed that forgotten things deserve to be remembered. And today, I am here to remember her. To remember my mother. And to honor every woman who ever built something extraordinary that the world was not ready to see. The applause that followed felt distant, muffled by the strange sensation of having finally spoken aloud what I had carried silently for so many years. Richard and Danielle had left before the ceremony concluded. I did not see them again that day. But as Owen and I drove back to our hotel that evening, the autumn light fading to purple over the hills I had once called home, I understood that something had irrevocably changed. Not for Richard, perhaps. His certainty would likely rebuild itself in new configurations, constructing new narratives to protect his self-image from the truth. But for me. For Owen. For the life we had built on foundations of honesty and presence and love. We were no longer hiding. And tomorrow would bring consequences neither of us could yet imagine. The morning after the dedication ceremony, I woke before dawn. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by replaying moments from the confrontation, by imagining conversations that had not happened and might never happen, by the strange sensation of having finally spoken truth after 17 years of careful silence. Owen was still asleep in his adjoining room. I dressed quietly and slipped outside, hoping the autumn air might clear my head before we began the long drive back to Portland. The hotel courtyard was small and peaceful, a garden space designed for contemplation. Wrought iron benches surrounded a fountain that had been turned off for the season. Fallen leaves gathered in corners, amber and crimson against the grey stone. I was not alone. Danielle Alcott sat on one of the benches, her hands folded over her pregnant belly, her expression troubled in the early light. She wore a simple coat over what appeared to be pajamas, as though she had left wherever she was staying without much thought for appearance. Mrs. Holloway. She looked up as I approached, and I saw that she had been crying. Not dramatically, not recently, but the evidence remained in the slight puffiness around her eyes, the careful way she held her composure. Mrs. Alcott. Is everything all right? Please call me Danielle. She gestured to the space beside her on the bench. I was hoping we might talk. Just the two of us. I hesitated, then sat, maintaining a careful distance between us. The morning was cold, and neither of us had dressed adequately for the temperature, but neither of us moved to leave. About yesterday. She stared straight ahead, watching a fallen leaf skitter across the pavement. About everything, really. I waited. Whatever she needed to say, she would say in her own time. Richard and I did fertility treatments for this pregnancy. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, as though she were discussing something that had happened to someone else. IVF. He told me it was because of my age. I am 32, which is not particularly old, but he said we should not leave anything to chance. I nodded slowly, beginning to understand where this was going. During our consultation, the doctor mentioned something about male factor considerations. I did not think much of it at the time. Richard dismissed it immediately. Said his family had never had fertility issues. Said the doctor was simply being thorough. The pattern was achingly familiar. The same deflection. The same absolute certainty. The same refusal to consider any narrative that did not place him at the center as the capable, virile patriarch. When I questioned him about it last night, after we returned to the house, he became defensive. Said it was a misunderstanding. Said the specialists had always confirmed his excellent results. Danielle finally turned to look at me, her eyes clear and direct despite the evidence of her earlier tears. That was a lie, was it not? I chose my words carefully. I never saw his test results directly. He told me the problem was entirely mine. But Dr. Pemberton was consulting on our case at the time, and she implied otherwise. She told my mother before she died that Richard's results showed issues that would make natural conception very difficult. Danielle closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this information. So he knew. All those years ago. He knew, and he let you believe you were the problem. It appears that way. And Owen. She opened her eyes again. There is no question that he is Richard's son. None whatsoever. I met her gaze steadily. I was with no one else during our marriage or in the months immediately following our separation. The timing is unmistakable. And you can see the resemblance yourself. Danielle nodded slowly, her hand moving in unconscious circles over her belly. A protective gesture I remembered from my own pregnancy, that instinctive shielding of new life. I am not here to cause problems for you or your son. Her voice was firm despite its quietness. But I needed to know the truth. For my own sake. For my daughter's sake. Something in her phrasing caught my attention. Your daughter. She smiled slightly, though the expression held more sadness than warmth. I stopped thinking of her as our daughter somewhere around 2 o'clock this morning, when I realized that the man I married is not the man I thought he was. The admission hung between us, heavy with implication. I understand that feeling. The words came out before I could consider whether to share them. The moment you realize that the person you love has been performing a version of themselves that does not actually exist. That you fell in love with a character they created rather than who they actually are. Danielle nodded. How long did it take you to stop loving the performance? Years. I admitted. Even after he left. Even after everything he said and did. Part of me kept hoping the person I had married was still in there somewhere. That the cruelty was an aberration rather than the truth. And now I understand that the cruelty was not an aberration. It was him, exposed. Everything else was the performance. We sat together in silence for a long moment, two women connected by the same man's deceptions, watching the morning light strengthen over a town he had transformed while destroying the people who loved him. I should warn you about something. Danielle's voice broke the quiet. Richard has been on the phone with his lawyers since early this morning. He is talking about rights, custody, DNA testing. He seems suddenly obsessed with the idea of Owen, as though 17 years of absence can be erased by legal maneuvering. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the autumn temperature. The old fear, the nightmare I had carried since Owen's birth, surged back with nauseating force. Owen is 17. My voice came out tighter than I intended. He is old enough that no court would force him to live with a father he has never known. His preferences would be considered. I do not think Richard is thinking clearly right now. Danielle's expression was troubled. His entire self-image is built on being the perfect Alcott. The successful continuation of a legacy that stretches back generations. Finding out that he has a son he never knew about, right as we are about to have our own child. It has disrupted something fundamental in him. The warning in her words was clear. Richard in turmoil was Richard at his most dangerous. A man whose certainty had been shattered would do anything to rebuild it, even if that meant destroying others in the process. Thank you for telling me. I stood, suddenly eager to return to Owen, to begin the drive home, to put distance between us and whatever Richard was planning. We are leaving for Portland this morning. Perhaps distance will cool his interest. Danielle shook her head slowly. I do not think so. Not this time. Richard does not abandon things he considers his. And now that he knows Owen exists, He will consider Owen his. She struggled slightly to rise from the bench, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward, and I automatically offered my hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong. "What will you do?" I asked, suddenly curious about this woman who seemed far more perceptive than I had initially given her credit for. "I am not sure yet." Her smile was sad but resolved. "But I need to make decisions based on truth, not the convenient fictions Richard creates. For my daughter's sake, if nothing else." She released my hand and turned toward the hotel entrance. "Mrs. Holloway." She paused without turning back. "Genevieve. Please." "Genevieve, then." She glanced over her shoulder. "For what it is worth, I am sorry. For what he did to you. For what he made you believe about yourself. And for the fact that your son grew up without knowing his father, all because Richard could not bear to be wrong about anything." Before I could respond, she walked away, disappearing into the hotel lobby. I stood alone in the courtyard, watching the fountain that no longer flowed, feeling the autumn wind cut through my inadequate clothing, trying to process everything she had said. Another woman navigating the complicated landscape of loving Richard Alcott. Another woman discovering that the man she married was not the man who existed. And somewhere, perhaps, an unexpected ally in whatever was coming. Owen was awake when I returned to the room, already packing his suitcase with the methodical efficiency he brought to every task. "I saw you talking to her." He did not look up from folding his shirt. "From the window. She came to warn me. Richard is talking to his lawyers about custody. DNA tests. Legal claims." Owen paused his packing, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "He cannot force me to do anything. I am 17. In less than a year, I will be a legal adult. What exactly does he think he can accomplish? I do not know." I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. But Richard does not think in terms of what is reasonable. He thinks in terms of what he wants. And what he wants is me. It was not a question. Owen resumed packing, his movements controlled and deliberate. "He wants the idea of you." I corrected gently. "The concept of an Alcott heir, who looks like the family portraits. Whether he actually wants the reality of knowing you, of being a father to you, that I cannot say." Owen zipped his suitcase closed and turned to face me fully. "Mom." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I have spent my entire life without him. I have built who I am without his input, without his money, without his approval. Nothing he does now can change that. He can hire 1,000 lawyers and demand 100 DNA tests, and at the end of it, I will still be the person you raised. The person Grandma loved. The person who knows exactly who his family is." I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "When did you get so wise?" He smiled, that crooked expression that reminded me so painfully of the man he resembled and so beautifully of the person he had become despite that resemblance. "I had a good teacher." We checked out of the hotel within the hour and began the drive back to Portland. The autumn landscape scrolled past the windows, familiar now from the journey down, but somehow different in the morning light. Owen was quiet for most of the drive, staring out at the passing scenery with an expression I could not quite read. "What happens when their baby is born?" His question came as we crossed the state line into Maine, the first words either of us had spoken in over an hour. "What do you mean? Will he lose interest in me once he has a proper Alcott heir? A legitimate child? A daughter he can raise from the beginning?" The question pierced my heart because it echoed my own unspoken fear. The worry that Richard's sudden interest in Owen was merely a reaction to shock, a temporary fixation that would fade once the novelty wore off. "I do not know." I kept my voice steady. "But if he does, that is his loss, not yours." Owen nodded slowly, still looking out the window. "I know that. Logically, I know that. But it is hard not to wonder." "Wonder what?" He was silent for a long moment. "Why I was not enough. 17 years ago. Why the possibility of me was not worth investigating. Why his certainty about himself mattered more than the truth about his son." The words hung between us, heavy with years of unasked questions. "You were always enough, Owen." I reached across to squeeze his hand briefly. "More than enough. The failure was never yours. It was his inability to imagine that he might be wrong about anything." He squeezed back, then returned his gaze to the window. We drove the rest of the way home in a silence that felt less like absence and more like healing. The weeks following our return to Portland passed with a strange normalcy. Owen returned to school, throwing himself into his senior year with characteristic intensity. I returned to work, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms of archival preservation. But beneath the surface, we both waited. For the legal letter that might arrive. For the phone call demanding compliance. For Richard to make whatever move his wounded pride required. The communication came 3 months later, and it was not what either of us expected. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by regular mail rather than certified courier. No legal firm's return address. Just Richard's name and a Milbrook address written in handwriting I had not seen in nearly 2 decades. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery, covered in the same handwriting. Not typed. Not dictated to an assistant. Written by Richard's own hand. I have had the DNA test conducted. The words began without preamble. I know Owen is my son. The results confirmed what I already understood the moment I saw him at the dedication ceremony. He is unmistakably mine. I am not writing to demand anything. I am not writing to attempt justifying the unjustifiable. I am writing to ask if, someday, Owen might be willing to know me. Not as a father. I forfeited that role 17 years ago when I refused to believe what you were trying to tell me. Just as someone who made catastrophic errors and has finally recognized them. I have no right to request this. I understand if you destroy this letter unread. I understand if Owen wants nothing to do with me. I understand if the answer is simply no, delivered once and never revisited. But I needed you to know that I know now. What I cost you. What I cost myself. What I cost him. I am sorry. I understand those words are insufficient. They are all I have. I read the letter 3 times before showing it to Owen. He studied it without expression, his grey eyes moving slowly across his father's words. When he finished, he set the paper aside and looked at me. What do you think? I think this is your decision to make. Not mine. But what do you think? He pressed. About him. About whether this is genuine. I considered the question carefully. I think he is genuinely shaken. I think confronting you, confronting the reality of what he did, disrupted something fundamental in how he understands himself. Whether that disruption leads to actual change or just a temporary adjustment in his performance, I cannot say. Owen nodded slowly. He says he does not want to be my father. That he forfeited that role. Yes. But he wants to know me anyway. That is what he says. Owen picked up the letter again, reading it a 4th time. Maybe I will let him. His voice was thoughtful rather than eager. Eventually. When I am ready. Not because I need him. Not because I am hoping he will become something he has never been. Just because I am curious about who he actually is, underneath all the performance. And if you meet him and discover he is exactly who he seemed to be at the dedication, then I will know. And I will stop wondering. He handed the letter back to me. You are my family, Mom. You and Grandma. You are the people who were there. He is just biology. But maybe biology is worth understanding. Maybe knowing where I came from will help me understand where I am going. I pulled him into a hug, this tall young man who had once been small enough to carry in my arms. Whatever you decide, I support you. Whatever boundaries you need to set, I will help you maintain them. And whatever happens, you never have to see him again if you choose not to. I know. He hugged me back. That is why I might choose to see him. Because I know I have a choice. The first meeting was arranged for the following month. Neutral territory. A small cafe in a town halfway between Portland and Milbrook, chosen specifically because neither of us had any history there. Richard arrived before we did. I spotted him through the window as Owen and I approached, sitting alone at a corner table, his posture uncertain in a way I had never witnessed during our marriage. He looked older than he had at the dedication, as though the intervening months had aged him years rather than weeks. The polished confidence was absent, replaced by something more human and considerably more vulnerable. You do not have to do this, I reminded Owen as we stood outside. We can turn around right now and drive home. I know. He straightened his shoulders. But I want to. We entered together, and Richard rose immediately from his seat. His eyes went to Owen first, hungry for details, cataloguing every feature with the desperate attention of a man trying to memorize something he fears will be taken away. Thank you for coming. His voice was rougher than I remembered. Both of you. We sat across from him, Owen and I side by side, presenting a united front without discussing it beforehand. I will be direct. Owen spoke first, his voice calm and measured. I agreed to this meeting because I have questions. Not because I am looking for a father. I already know who my family is. But I am curious about you. About who you actually are. About why you made the choices you made. Richard nodded slowly. That is fair. More than fair. I have conditions. Name them. Owen leaned forward slightly. No lawyers. No courts. No custody battles or legal threats. If we do this, it is because we choose to, not because you force the issue. Agreed. No buying my affection. I do not need expensive gifts or trips or access to your money. I am not interested in being an Alcott heir. I am interested in understanding my own history. Understood. And most importantly, Owen's voice hardened slightly. No disrespecting my mother. Ever. She is the one who was there for 17 years while you were building your empire and marrying other women. She is the reason I am who I am. If you cannot treat her with respect, we have nothing to discuss. Something shifted in Richard's expression. Something that might have been shame, or might have been the first glimmer of genuine respect. Those terms are more than reasonable. He met Owen's eyes directly. You have my word. Then I suppose we can try. Owen leaned back, his posture relaxing slightly. Maybe start with occasional meetings. See where it goes. No promises beyond that. The conversation that followed was awkward, stilted, two strangers trying to find common ground across a chasm of years and choices. Richard asked about Owen's interests. Owen responded with careful neutrality, sharing enough to be polite without offering genuine intimacy. I observed from the sidelines, watching for any sign that Richard's old patterns were reasserting themselves. The condescension. The certainty. The casual cruelty disguised as observation. But he seemed genuinely different. Smaller, somehow. More tentative. As though the collapse of his self-image had left him uncertain how to navigate even simple conversations. When the meeting ended, we all stood awkwardly by our respective cars. Thank you again. Richard's voice was quiet. For giving me a chance I do not deserve. Owen regarded him thoughtfully. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were. Whether you actually become better remains to be seen. He turned and walked to our car without looking back. I lingered for a moment, facing the man I had once loved and then learned to survive without. He is remarkable. Richard's eyes were still on Owen's retreating figure. You did something extraordinary, raising him alone. I did what any mother would do. I loved him. I showed up. I chose him every single day. Something I failed to do. Yes. He finally looked at me, and I saw the devastation in his expression. The full weight of what he had lost, visible for the first time. I spent 17 years believing my legacy depended on having an heir who carried my name. Someone I could shape in my own image. Someone who would validate everything I believed about myself and my family. He gestured toward Owen, now seated in our car. Instead, I have a son who is brilliant and kind and strong. Who looks exactly like my father and has none of my father's flaws. Who was raised by a woman I discarded, and who turned out better than anything I could have produced. I did not know how to respond to this unprecedented honesty. The irony is not lost on me, Genevieve. He continued. I got exactly what I wanted. A son who carries the Alcott features, who will continue the genetic line. And I have no claim to any of it. No right to take credit for who he became. Because I was not there. Because I chose not to be there. That is correct. He nodded slowly, accepting the judgment without argument. I do not expect forgiveness. I am not asking for reconciliation. I just want you to know that I understand now. What I did to you. What my certainty cost both of us. I studied him for a long moment, searching for the performance, the manipulation, the hidden agenda. I found only exhaustion and regret. Understanding is a start. I finally said. What you do with that understanding remains to be seen. I walked to the car and drove away without looking back. The months that followed brought changes I could never have anticipated. Richard kept his word about respecting the boundaries Owen had established. Their meetings began as brief coffee conversations, carefully neutral, focused on discovering shared interests rather than forcing premature intimacy. Owen reported back after each encounter with characteristic thoughtfulness. He is not what I expected. He told me one evening as we prepared dinner together. He listens. He asks questions. He does not try to impress me with his wealth or his accomplishments. He just seems genuinely curious about who I am. And how does that make you feel? Owen considered the question while chopping vegetables. Confused, mostly. I spent my whole life imagining who he was. Building a picture of a villain who abandoned us without caring. And now he is just this sad, uncertain man who seems to regret everything. Regret does not erase the past. No. But it is hard to hate someone who is so clearly already punishing himself. The relationship developed slowly, carefully, with Owen maintaining firm control over its pace and parameters. They discovered shared interests in architecture and history, ironic given Richard's career as a developer and Owen's passion for preservation. They discussed books and ideas and the complicated mechanics of how things worked. Richard never attempted to buy Owen's affection. Never tried to insert himself into family moments that did not include him. Never pushed for more than Owen was willing to give. I watched from a careful distance, ready to intervene if necessary, but the intervention never became necessary. 6 months after their first meeting, news arrived from Milbrook. Danielle had delivered a healthy baby girl. They named her Claire, a name Danielle had chosen herself, not a family name, not another link in the Alcott chain. And Richard and Danielle were divorcing. The information came through Owen, who had heard it from Richard during one of their meetings. She said she needed to build a life based on truth rather than convenient fictions. Owen relayed the conversation. That she could not raise a daughter while married to a man who had spent decades constructing lies about himself. How did Richard respond to that? He said he understood. That he did not blame her. That she deserved better than what he had been able to give. Owen paused, his expression troubled. I think losing another marriage shook him more than finding out about me did. Like it confirmed everything he was afraid was true about himself. The divorce finalized that winter. Danielle received generous terms and full custody of Claire. With Richard granted visitation rights he reportedly exercised with quiet consistency. 2 months later, she reached out to me directly. I would like Owen to meet his half-sister. Her voice on the phone was warm but careful, navigating the complicated territory between us. If you are comfortable with that. I know the circumstances are unusual. That is Owen's decision to make. I replied. But I have no objection. The meeting happened on a spring afternoon, in the garden of the farmhouse where Owen had grown up. Danielle arrived with Claire in her arms, a tiny bundle of dark hair and grey eyes, the Alcott features already visible in her infant face. Owen held his half-sister with remarkable gentleness, studying her small features with the focused attention he brought to everything. She looks like the baby pictures Mom keeps of me. She does. Danielle agreed. The resemblance is striking. They spent the afternoon together, former wife and current wife connected by the children they were raising separately, finding unexpected common ground in their shared experience of loving Richard and learning to live without him. I want Claire to know the truth as she grows up. Danielle told me as we watched Owen introduce the baby to the barn cats. Not convenient fictions. Not sanitized versions of history. The actual truth about who her father was and the choices he made. That is a complicated thing to explain to a child. Yes. But you managed it with Owen. And he turned out extraordinary. I had help. My mother was there for every difficult conversation, every complicated question. Danielle nodded thoughtfully. Would you be willing to help me? Sometimes. When the questions get too hard to answer alone. The request surprised me. 2 women, connected by the same man's failures, building an unexpected alliance. I would be honored. The years passed with a particular rhythm that time adopts when you stop measuring it against what might have been and start appreciating what is. Owen graduated from high school with honors, delivered a valedictorian speech that moved half the audience to tears, and left for university to study historical architecture. The combination of his passions, his father's interest in building and his mother's dedication to preservation, merged into something uniquely his own. Richard attended the graduation ceremony from the back row, watching the young man he had once denied become someone remarkable. They had developed what Owen called a cordial relationship, meeting every few months, sharing conversations about ideas and interests, but never approaching the intimacy of actual father and son. Owen still did not call him Dad. Still introduced him as Richard Alcott rather than my father. Still maintained the emotional distance he had established from their first meeting. And Richard accepted this. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he accepted something less than what he wanted, recognizing that he had no right to demand more. My own life transformed during these years. The Portland Historical Archives promoted me to director. My work received recognition I had never sought but welcomed nonetheless. The name my grandmother had built, the legacy my mother had supported, continued through me. And then there was David. Dr. David Warren, a structural engineer specializing in historical preservation, entered my life at a conference 3 years after the Milbrook confrontation. He was consulting on a restoration project I was documenting, and our professional collaboration gradually developed into something more. Unlike Richard, David possessed no need to dominate or control. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He supported my work without attempting to direct it. He treated Owen with respect and genuine interest, never trying to replace the father figure Owen had chosen not to have. We married quietly, in a ceremony attended by close friends and family, including Owen and, unexpectedly, Danielle and young Claire. Richard was not invited. Owen made that decision, and I supported it. He has not earned the right to celebrate your happiness. Owen explained when I asked if he was certain. He watched you suffer for years. He does not get to stand there smiling while you find joy with someone else. The logic was sound, if perhaps harsh. But when Owen graduated from university, then completed his master's degree, then accepted a position with a prestigious preservation firm, Richard was there each time. Watching from the periphery. Never pushing for inclusion. Simply bearing witness to the life unfolding without him. The final transformation came with Owen's wedding. He was 27, established in his career, confident in who he had become. Margaret Chen, a conservation scientist with quiet strength and fierce intelligence, had captured his heart in a way that reminded me of my own mother, that same blend of gentleness and steel. The wedding was small and intentional, held in the garden of the farmhouse where Owen had grown up, surrounded by people who had chosen to be family rather than those connected merely by blood. Richard received an invitation. Owen insisted on that much, though he was not included in the wedding party, not asked to give a speech, not positioned anywhere that would suggest fatherly importance. He sat near the back, alone, watching his son exchange vows with a woman he would never truly know. Owen's words during the ceremony cut through the autumn air with quiet precision. I learned what family means from my mother, who chose me every single day. From my grandmother, who showed me that love is built through presence rather than promises. From the community of people who supported us when support was scarce. He glanced toward Richard, just briefly, and I learned that blood alone does not make a family. That showing up matters more than genetics. That the people who stay are more important than the people who share your features. Richard's expression remained composed, but I saw something break behind his eyes. The full weight of what his choices had cost him, delivered by the son he had abandoned, on the day that son built a family of his own. The reception was warm and joyful, filled with dancing and laughter and the particular happiness that comes from witnessing love freely given and gratefully received. Richard approached me near the end of the evening, when most guests had departed and Owen and Margaret were saying their final goodbyes. You did well. The words came out rough, as though they cost him something to say. Better than I would have. Better than I could have imagined. I studied him in the fading light. The silver had spread through his hair. Lines had deepened around his eyes. He looked older than his years, worn down by something more than time. I know. He nodded slowly, accepting the simple agreement without offense. I have a granddaughter now. Or I will, when Margaret and Owen have children. Another generation I will watch from a distance. Another family milestone I will observe but not participate in. That is the consequence of your choices, Richard. Delivered across 2 decades. Building with every year you were not there. He was quiet for a long moment. I spent my whole life believing legacy was about blood. About names carried forward. About children shaped in my image. And now I understand that legacy is about presence. About showing up day after day. About being there for the ordinary moments that turn out to matter more than any grand gesture. He looked toward Owen, who was helping Margaret into their car. I have a son who carries my features and my genes. The Alcott legacy continues, technically speaking. But Owen is not an Alcott. He is a Holloway. Raised by Holloway women who taught him what I never could have. His voice cracked slightly. My legacy is absence. That is what I pass down. The knowledge of what happens when a father chooses his pride over his child. I had nothing to offer him. No comfort for a wound he had inflicted on himself. No absolution for choices that had shaped all our lives. I hope that knowledge serves some purpose. I finally said, for you. For whoever comes after. He nodded once, then walked to his car and drove away. I never saw him alone again. 5 years after Owen's wedding, I stood in the garden my mother had planted decades earlier, watching Owen and Margaret's daughter chase butterflies through the flower beds. They had named her Eleanor, after my mother. A small girl with dark hair and grey eyes, the Alcott features visible in her young face, but softened by something gentler, something that came from generations of women who had chosen presence over pride. Owen sat beside me on the porch, watching his daughter with the particular attention of a father who understood exactly how precious ordinary moments could be. He sent another birthday card. Owen mentioned, for Eleanor. Richard had been sending cards and small gifts for every milestone. First birthday. First steps. First words. Always from a distance. Always without expectation of response. Owen accepted them without encouragement or rejection. Filed them away in a box he kept in his study. Evidence, perhaps, of a grandfather Eleanor might want to understand someday. Does he ever ask to meet her? No. Owen shook his head. I think he understands that is not his decision to make. That he forfeited the right to demand anything a long time ago. And if Eleanor wants to know him someday, then I will tell her the truth. About who he was. About what he did. About the fact that he changed too late to matter but changed nonetheless. And I will let her make her own choice. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching Eleanor discover a ladybug on a flower stem, her small face illuminated with wonder. Richard had gotten exactly what he wanted, in the end. A son who bore his features. A genetic legacy that would continue into future generations. The Alcott bloodline preserved despite everything he had done to sabotage it. But he had gotten it without the meaning he had sought. Without the relationship he had imagined. Without any claim to the family his choices had created. He appeared occasionally at public events where Owen received recognition for his preservation work. Always in the back. Always alone. Always watching with an expression that combined pride and devastation in equal measure. The man who had valued legacy above everything else spent his remaining years observing a legacy that did not include him. A son who treated him with polite distance. A granddaughter who did not know his name. A family that flourished in his absence rather than his presence. That was the consequence. Not revenge. Not confrontation. Not dramatic justice delivered in a single devastating moment. Just the quiet accumulation of all the days he had not been there. All the moments he had missed. All the love he had forfeited when he chose his certainty over his family. Mom. Owen's voice brought me back to the present. Yes. Thank you. For what? For everything. For choosing me when it would have been easier not to. For showing up every single day. For teaching me what family actually means. I reached over to squeeze his hand. You were never a burden, Owen. You were never an inconvenience or a complication. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Eleanor came running toward the porch, clutching something in her small fist. Grandma, look. A ladybug. She climbed into my lap, opening her hand to reveal the small red beetle resting on her palm. Be gentle with it. I told her. It is a living thing. It deserves respect. She nodded solemnly, lowering her hand to let the ladybug crawl onto a nearby flower. Goodbye, ladybug. She whispered. Thank you for visiting. Owen caught my eye over his daughter's head, and we shared a smile that held everything words could not express. This was the legacy that mattered. Not bloodlines or family names or genetic features passed from generation to generation. Presence. Attention. Love made visible through 1,000 small gestures repeated across years. The ladybug spread its wings and flew away, disappearing into the garden my mother had planted, surrounded by flowers my grandmother had loved, watched by 3 generations of people who understood what family truly meant. Somewhere, miles away, Richard Alcott sat alone in a house filled with expensive things, surrounded by the evidence of wealth that had never purchased what he actually wanted. I did not think about him often anymore. He had become a distant figure, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when pride mattered more than love. But occasionally, in quiet moments, I felt something that was not quite forgiveness but approached it. He had missed everything that mattered. Every morning of waking Owen for school. Every evening of helping with homework. Every holiday. Every achievement. Every struggle. Every ordinary moment that accumulated into an extraordinary life. That absence was its own punishment. More devastating than any revenge I could have planned. And the life I had built, the family I had raised, the love that surrounded me in this garden on this ordinary afternoon, that was all the justice I needed. Some stories end with confrontation. With the guilty party finally brought low. With dramatic reversals and shouted accusations and the satisfaction of seeing cruelty punished. This story ends with a ladybug flying through a garden. With a granddaughter's small hand in mine. With a son who became everything his father never was. With the quiet certainty that choosing love over pride, presence over absence, truth over convenient fiction, that choice matters more than any grand gesture ever could. Richard wanted legacy. He got exactly what he asked for. He just never understood that legacy is not about what you leave behind. It is about what you were present for. And presence was the one thing he never offered. If this story moved you, if you have ever built something beautiful from broken pieces, if you have ever chosen presence over pride, share it with someone who needs to remember that flourishing is the only answer to abandonment. Subscribe to Tales of Desire with Mr. Walker, because some truths are worth telling again and again. And thank you, beloved listeners, for staying until the end. Your presence here, your attention, your willingness to sit with a story until its final words, that is a gift I do not take for granted. Until next time, remember that family is not about blood. It is about showing up. Day after day. Ordinary moment after ordinary moment. That is where love lives. That is where legacy is built. That is everything.